The North Hollywood Shootout. It's the story of a bank robbery that went horribly, horribly wrong. A surreal hold-up, like something out of a movie, or, dare I say, an open-world video game. What happened in Los Angeles on the morning of February 28, 1997, was very much real. That day, two heavily armed and burly men decided to pull off an exceptionally brutal heist. An utterly botched robbery that quickly escalated into a massive shootout. Two robbers against nearly 400 police officers, including SWAT teams, all unfolding live on national television. Unprecedented in U.S. history. Armed with a formidable arsenal of illegally modified firearms, the two bandits shot at anything that moved in an attempt to escape the crime scene. Civilians and police alike, no one was safe from the armor-piercing rounds that flew everywhere. Some of their military-grade weapons fired 10 rounds per second, a simply staggering and outrageous amount of firepower for a bank robbery. On the other side, the police, armed only with handguns and short-range shotguns to contend with, struggled to contain the two robbers' advance. But the bullets they fired barely fazed them, because in addition to their combat weapons, the robbers were equipped with head-to-toe body armor. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Mattisuriano were the two men behind this insane robbery. They were gun enthusiasts and bodybuilders who had met at a gym in 1989 and then forged a friendship built on a shared hatred for society. Two determined robbers, unfazed by death, who for nearly an hour held Los Angeles in terror. Two robbers about whom it's unclear if they came to rob a bank or wage a war. What's certain is that they pulled off one of the most violent bank robberies in history. So violent, it's now simply known as the North Hollywood Shootout. When thinking of bank robberies in the United States, one's mind often goes back to the 1930s and the era of John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, or Bonnie and Clyde. A period in American history when armed robberies proliferated. The Great Depression had hit the United States hard, creating an atmosphere of economic hardship that pushed more and more individuals into robbery. The result was a staggering rise in holdups across the country, to the point where some referred to those years as the golden age of bank robbers. Fortunately, this trend was eventually curbed, and the following decades were, let's say, relatively calm in terms of armed robberies. Authorities had managed to put an end to this incredible surge in crime, and it was thought that all that was history. Except, not at all, as bank robberies saw a real resurgence starting in the 1960s, more precisely between 1965 and 1975. Armed attacks skyrocketed, jumping from 850 to nearly 3,500 per year. A spectacular increase, you might say, and yet, it didn't stop there. Indeed, the trend continued into the 1970s, then into the 1980s with 5,500 robberies in 1985 alone. The curve continued to climb, reaching even more staggering numbers in the following decade. With nearly 7,900 robberies in 1990 and 9,388 the following year. A true epidemic of armed robberies, the epicenter of which was all the way out west in the United States, in Los Angeles. The city that was dubbed the National Bank Robbery Capital. And an enviable title, I'll grant you that. Not exactly a tourism booster. But believe me, the City of Angels certainly earned that distinction. In fact, you just need to look at the crime statistics from that period to understand. Now, remember when I mentioned that 1991 recorded over 9,300 robberies? Well, get this, a quarter of that astonishing figure came from Los Angeles County alone. Yeah, 2,355 robberies in that year alone. And the kicker is, that wasn't even the highest total recorded by the city. Because then came 1992, when the peak was finally hit, with 2,641 armed attacks. Roughly speaking, 7 bank robberies a day, or 1 robbery every business hour. Just let that sink in. In fact, There were so many in the 80s and 90s that Hollywood took notice, producing some of the most iconic bank robbery films set in Southern California. Like 1991's Point Break, and especially the definitive heist movie, 1995's Heat. During this period, Los Angeles was plagued by a relentlessly increasing wave of bank robberies. While the numbers were alarming, even more alarming was the brutal violence the gangsters used during these armed heists. Most of them were equipped as if heading into a war zone. Submachine guns, assault rifles, bulletproof vests. It felt like with this new wave of robbers, the ends justified the means. And that nothing would stop them from grabbing their desired loot. To the point where some decided if killing was required, they'd do it. What truly transformed bank robberies into violent, routine operations in Los Angeles was a notorious heist that took place on September 5, 1991. That day, two men, part of the West Hills Bandits, a robbery crew well known to law enforcement, entered a Wells Fargo branch in the Tarzana neighborhood of Los Angeles. Heavily armed and masked, they paradoxically displayed a disarming politeness during the robbery. They gathered customers and employees, asking them to remain calm, explaining that they were there just for the bank's money and that cooperation would ensure no one got hurt. The establishment was emptied in less than 2 minutes. True professionals, no doubt, and courteous too, as they even wished the hostages well upon their departure. The two robbers made off happy, with a sizable haul in their pockets. $437,000, a record take for the Los Angeles jurisdiction at the time. Which was, unfortunately, leaked to the public by mistake by a bank employee. Because it was truly from that moment on that things took a sharp turn, for among those who heard about it were certain criminals in the city, already salivating at the amount of money stolen. They now had proof that serious money could be made by robbing banks in Los Angeles. This was the case for Robert Sheldon Brown, known as Casper, a prominent member of the Crips gang. He decided that bank robberies could indeed be a lucrative business venture. Within a few weeks, he sent out dozens of armed crews of teenagers to rob banks across the city. Kids often barely 13 years old who wreaked havoc in every bank they entered. Because, unlike the West Hills Bandits, who were polite and meticulous, these kids were nervous, undisciplined, and above all, extremely violent. The baby bandits, as the FBI dubbed them, would enter banks by blasting volleys of gunfire indiscriminately into the ceiling, when it wasn't at themselves or their accomplices. When they attacked, no one was spared. Tellers were needlessly pistol-whipped, or hostage customers had their wedding rings violently torn from their fingers by the baby bandits. Of course, their amateurism ultimately doomed them, to the point where they were mass captured by authorities. But the more who were captured, the more Casper sent out. The young teenage gangsters proliferated, and Casper was, shall we say, never short on personnel. Thus, thanks to his army of baby bandits, he managed to orchestrate over 175 robberies, more than anyone else in U.S. history, without participating in a single one himself. If Los Angeles earned the title of bank robbery capital in the 90s, then know that it was largely thanks to him. The same goes for the sudden surge in violence committed during these same holdups at that time. And even though Robert Sheldon Brown would later be arrested, others would follow in his footsteps. Like these two young men, who had undoubtedly watched too much Heat, and who would, in turn, try their hand at bank robbery with equally extreme and gratuitous violence. Two guys who were none other than Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasoriano, the perpetrators of the North Hollywood Shootout. By the mid-1990s, the golden age of armed robberies in Los Angeles appeared to be drawing to a close. The number of heists in the city had plummeted dramatically, dropping from a peak of 2,641 in 1992 to just 749 the following year. The main reason for this sharp decline was the 1993 arrest of the leader of the infamous Baby Bandits. This capture allowed LAPD officers to finally catch a break, at least until 1996. That year, a new crew of bank robbers emerged, the duo at the center of this story, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matassarianu. To understand these two men, it is essential to delve into their past. Larry Phillips Jr., of Mexican and Italian heritage, was born on September 20, 1970, in Los Angeles, into a family that was far from conventional. His father, Larry Phillips Sr., had several run-ins with the law throughout his life, which did not make for an easy childhood for his son. It is said that the elder Phillips steered Larry Jr. toward a life of crime, instilling in him his own deep-seated hatred for police officers. According to Larry Phillips Sr., this animosity first took root on his son's 6th birthday, when FBI agents burst into their home, weapons drawn, to arrest him. Another account suggests the father further influenced his son during mountain outings, fostering in Larry a profound aversion to law enforcement that would follow him for the rest of his life. Larry's true obsession was money. He wanted to get rich fast. He aimed to achieve this by drawing inspiration from his idols, who were prominent figures in white-collar crime responsible for billions of dollars in fraud. Larry's half-brother described him as being solely driven by money and power. Inevitably, the moment arrived. On September 2, 1989, Larry committed his first criminal act, shoplifting a suit valued at $400, for which he was arrested and prosecuted. He would sometimes take his half-brother to affluent parts of the city, claiming it was to inspire him. He frequently talked about the allure of wealth. Indeed, money was the driving force behind Larry Phillips Jr. Another major passion was bodybuilding, which he practiced diligently. This pursuit would eventually lead him to meet the second key player in the North Hollywood Shootout, Emil Matassarianu. Gold's Gym in Venice Beach was where Larry and Emil first crossed paths. Larry, a devoted bodybuilder, had dreamed of becoming the next Arnold Schwarzenegger since his teenage years. He wanted to make it big in that field, convinced it could be a fast track to wealth. He threw himself into it, devouring a mountain of books on the subject and training relentlessly. However, becoming a bodybuilding star is not for everyone. With genetics playing a huge role, Larry eventually realized his dream would remain forever out of reach and abandoned his ambition of becoming Mr. Olympia. This disillusionment did not, however, stop him from remaining disciplined in his training. Larry continued to frequent Gold's Gym until the day he met another regular, also passionate about lifting weights and, notably, firearms. Emil Matassarianu, of Romanian origin, was born in Timișoara, Romania, on July 19, 1966. He was an only child whose parents decided to leave Europe in the mid-1970s to settle in Los Angeles, California. Like Larry, Emil endured a difficult childhood, though for different reasons. He was often the target of relentless teasing from his classmates because of his Romanian accent and his struggles with weight. This constant bullying led him to spend a significant portion of his time holed up at home in front of his computer. During this period, he cultivated a fascination for firearms. He did manage to make a few friends, but never kept them for long. His mother described him as a social misfit. At home, tensions escalated as Emil's parents argued more and more frequently. A divorce was looming, but for the time being, Emil seemed to cope with the situation. He continued his studies, completing a 3-year program in electronic engineering, earning his diploma in 1987. Soon after, he started his own computer business. His mother wanted him to pursue further education, but he desperately wanted to enter the workforce and start making money. The persistent parental squabbles and the pressure he felt gradually began to take a heavy toll on him, leading to violent outbursts. One such incident involved him throwing a chainsaw at his neighbor's face because their dog had dared to walk on his lawn. At this point, computers and guns were no longer enough to alleviate Emil's stress, as neighbors often saw him on his porch cleaning his firearms. The need to channel his rage eventually led him to another passion, one that initially helped him lose over 100 pounds. It was also this passion that led him to meet his future partner in crime, Larry. It was 1989 at Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, Los Angeles. Emil, a regular at the gym, encountered a man who would drastically alter his path. This young man, like Emil, enjoyed lifting weights and had a fondness for firearms, and he would soon pull Emil into a frenzied spree of crimes. Larry clearly asserted himself as the dominant force in this new friendship, to the point where he would psychologically manipulate Emil. According to Larry's half-brother, Emil was merely a follower in their dynamic. Larry controlled every aspect of Emil Matasareanu's life. He likely fueled Emil's resentment towards the police and society, and even influenced his choice of partner. His half-brother also mentioned that Emil had returned to Romania in the early 1990s to bring his grandmother to the United States. He used that opportunity to bring back a Romanian woman, whom he later married. Larry, for his part, was involved with a woman of Hispanic descent. This seemingly unremarkable friendship became the catalyst for the events that would unfold in North Hollywood on February 28, 1997. What began as a casual bond soon transformed into a deadly partnership. The city of Los Angeles was utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. October 23, 1993, Glendale, Los Angeles County. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu peeled out of a gas station in a red Ford Thunderbird. Nearby, Police Sergeant Ian Grimes spotted them and immediately took off in pursuit. After pulling them over, the officer began asking routine questions. Larry seemed hesitant when Grimes started asking questions. Worse yet, Emil straight up lied to the officer, claiming the car belonged to Larry's mother. In reality, they'd rented it at the airport. Emil should have known that before even stopping them, the officer would have run their license plate, which he obviously did. Larry's hesitation and his friend's blatant deception immediately raised red flags for Agent Grimes. He asked Larry to step out of the vehicle and come to the back for a search. What he found was a gun. The officer's suspicions skyrocketed. He immediately called for backup, and when they popped the trunk, it was jaw-dropping. He and his colleagues discovered a full-blown arsenal: assault rifles, machine guns, explosive devices, bulletproof vests, smoke grenades, enough to leave any cop speechless. Had Larry and Emil been speeding in a desperate rush to a hideout, trying to stash all that gear? It was certainly possible. One thing was for sure: they weren't going anywhere now that they were stopped. Larry and Emil were identified by police, then sentenced to jail time for conspiracy to commit robbery, earning them about 100 days each behind bars. They served their respective sentences, only to be released back onto the streets of Los Angeles, somehow still with a significant portion of their arsenal. Of course, they clearly hadn't learned their lesson, and were already gearing up for their first heist. Their first armed robbery, a daylight armored car heist, took place on June 14, 1995, in Los Angeles' Winnetka neighborhood. It was 12:25 p.m. when the two men, masked and armed with assault rifles, ambushed a Brinks armored truck. Inside were two security guards, one of whom was 51-year-old Herman Cook, a father of two. One of the bandits yelled at pedestrians to clear out before they sprang into action. The robbery, incredibly brutal, began with volleys of unprovoked gunfire on the armored van, all under the horrified gaze of a dozen witnesses. The bandits didn't even give the security guards a chance to hand over the money; they simply opened fire without warning. With their automatic assault rifles firing armor-piercing bullets, they gave Herman Cook no chance, killing him at point-blank range. They then shot his colleague, severely wounding him, before escaping with just one bag of cash. Larry Phillips and Emil Matasareanu's haul that day was $122,500, taken at the cost of a man's life. Even the reward offered for their capture would end up being more than what they stole that day. 9 months later, on March 27, 1996, Larry and Emil targeted another armored vehicle, using an equally direct and brutal method. They were in a van when one of them, from the passenger side, opened fire on the windshield of a Brinks truck heading in the opposite direction. One of the guards inside was slightly injured by glass fragments, but that wasn't enough to stop the money truck, which sped up to escape its attackers. Larry and Emil made a U-turn to try and catch up, but they failed. It was their first major bust. To erase their tracks, they set their van on fire before switching vehicles and fleeing. Strangely, it was a scene eerily reminiscent of the movie Heat, which had just come out a month earlier. The duo followed up with yet another armed robbery. Armored cars were out. Now, they decided to dive into the deep end by hitting banks. Their first target, a Bank of America branch in Los Angeles' Van Nuys neighborhood. It was just before 10 a.m. when the two robbers, armed with automatic rifles, stormed into the bank and fired about 10 shots into the ceiling. Inside, about 30 people were taken hostage, including several children, all terrified by what was unfolding. Some of the children started crying, which quickly annoyed the two men, who outright threatened to kill them if their mothers didn't make them stop. Larry and Emil were absolutely ruthless. All they cared about was the money, and that day, they snagged a hefty sum, over $755,000. Then, on May 31, 1996, they did it again. Larry and Emil hit a second Bank of America branch, not far from where they'd committed the armored car robbery that had cost Herman Cook his life a year earlier. The robbery began at 10:05 a.m., using the identical method they'd employed earlier that month. This time, however, they left two tellers wounded in their wake. The stolen amount was even larger than the previous one, nearly $800,000, bringing their total to almost $1.5 million in just 30 days. Investigators were certainly on alert. For the first time, they were seeing the two robbers they were hunting via surveillance cameras. Two masked robbers, of imposing and intimidating build, walking slowly, assault rifles in hand. It was an atypical robber profile, and what really jumped out to FBI agents was how long it took the duo to pull off both stick-ups. 6 minutes for the first, and 8 for the second, which is an eternity for bank robberies. In fact, it was as if they weren't in a hurry during the robberies, maintaining the same pace even during their escape. It was almost as if, ultimately, it wasn't the heist itself that drove them, but the potential armed confrontation with law enforcement. Perhaps a showdown with authorities was their ultimate goal? Well, if that was what they were hoping for, they were about to get their wish. Because we're finally getting to the robbery we're truly interested in. The one that would soon pit Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu against an armada of police officers right in the heart of Los Angeles. The North Hollywood shootout wasn't far off. February 28, 1997, Los Angeles. That morning, over the City of Angels, the weather was mild and pleasant. The clear blue sky above the city promised a bright, sunny day. Just another winter day, as the residents of North Hollywood might describe it. They were blissfully unaware that their neighborhood was about to become the stage for one of the most violent urban shootouts in history. On Laurel Canyon Boulevard, two men in a white Chevrolet with heavily tinted windows sped down towards a bank in North Hollywood. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu were primed and ready for their next big score. With them was an impressive arsenal, including several illegally modified military-grade weapons. Their tactical vests were overflowing with ammunition magazines. Larry himself carried nearly 45 pounds of gear, including homemade body armor that covered him from head to toe. Emil, more lightly equipped, only had a single metal ballistic plate protecting his vital organs. A short while earlier, they had swallowed tranquilizers to curb their stress before going into action. At 9:11 a.m., the duo gradually approached their target, a Bank of America branch in North Hollywood. The car pulled into a spot, but surprisingly, the robbers parked it facing a wall, a curious strategy considering backing in. This would have allowed for a faster getaway. No matter, the heist was about to begin. Larry and Emil donned their balaclavas and sunglasses. Larry did a quick check on the police scanner, which he illegally possessed. He then gave the signal to go. It was 9:17 a.m. when the two men exited the vehicle one after another. Their watches were set for 8 minutes, the estimated time before police intervention. AK-47s in hand, they headed towards the bank's entrance. Their hulking, bodybuilder physiques, combined with the heavy gear they wore, made them look like two intimidating monsters about to unleash terror. The robbery kicked off when Larry ordered a bank customer to go inside the establishment. Two police officers near the bank then witnessed this surreal scene. The heist had barely begun and the alarm was already raised. Unaware of this, Larry and Emil continued their robbery. Then, to emphasize their demands, the two men riddled the establishment's ceiling with gunfire. The 30 or so employees and customers present that morning in the Bank of America were terrified. It wasn't long before LAPD patrol cars came screeching onto the crime scene, having no idea what truly awaited them. Inside the bank, Larry ensured that all the hostages remained still. Around 30 men, women, and children lay sprawled on the floor, horrified by the criminal. He strode through the room, threatening death to anyone who dared defy his authority. Meanwhile, Emil set about collecting the cash. He then backhanded a 79-year-old woman across the head, who wasn't moving fast enough. He then fired a dozen shots at the teller counter's security door. With the door obliterated, Emil then headed into the private section of the bank where the vault and other employees were located. Among the employees was the bank's assistant manager, who held the keys to the vault. Seeing the robber's determination, he quickly granted access without resistance. That didn't stop Emil from pistol whipping him across the head anyway. Once inside the vault, his frustration mounted. The assistant manager unlocked secured boxes, which only contained small bundles of cash. The robber's large black bag wasn't filling up fast enough to his liking. They had anticipated a haul of $750,000, but what they were getting was barely half that, just over $300,000. Emil then stared furiously at his hostage, repeatedly demanding more money. But at that moment, it was all the cash the bank had available. An unsettling silence fell. Then, suddenly, the displeased robber fired a burst from his assault rifle into the vault's ceiling. Meanwhile, Larry continued to keep an eye on the hostages, pacing back and forth across the bank lobby, when he noticed something strange outside. Indeed, no cars were moving anymore. Larry stepped out to investigate. He scanned the surroundings. He spotted a police car parked to his right, but seemingly unconcerned, he casually returned inside the bank. Larry then became agitated with the hostages and fired his AK-47. By this point, police officers had already surrounded the building. Taking cover behind their vehicles, they were ready to engage the perpetrators. Or so they thought. It would soon become clear that their handguns and short-range shotguns would prove ineffective. Back inside the bank, Emil and Larry were disappointed. The $303,305 haul was clearly not enough. But time was running out, and more police were arriving by the minute. A confrontation seemed inevitable, foreshadowing impending chaos, and the fact that police officers hadn't had enough time to clear the area of all civilian presence only made things worse. Many people were still out and about in the neighborhood. For the bank robbers, it was time to make their exit. Larry ordered the security guard to take all the hostages into the vault. Then, the two men headed towards the exit door, where police officers waited for them. With their military-grade weapons and multiple layers of body armor, the upcoming confrontation already looked wildly uneven. At 9:24 a.m., Larry Phillips was the first to emerge from the building. He pointed his assault rifle towards the police vehicles, parked about 60 yards away, and opened fire. The sound of the bullets was deafening, echoing throughout the entire neighborhood. Police officers and civilians dove to the ground to avoid the armor-piercing rounds from the automatic rifles. The cars they were hiding behind were riddled like paper. Some bullets even exited the other side of the vehicle body. Fortunately, no one was inside the targeted vehicles, or death would have been instantaneous. More than 200 rounds were fired by Larry alone. After that, the gunman retreated back into the bank. This initial volley of gunfire already left several people injured, including 2 civilians. Then, at 9:30 a.m., Larry reappeared. This time, he was accompanied by Emil, who was carrying the bag of money. The bursts of gunfire resumed, this time with even greater intensity. John Caparelli, a police officer present that day, later recalled the scene. The rain of bullets then struck several officers, one severely, taking a round to the thigh that shattered his femur. For the police officers on the scene, it was virtually impossible to match the firepower. The 2 bank robbers simply possessed a far superior arsenal. Officer Caparelli shared this assessment, remembering the feeling of the moment. Larry and Emil seemed invincible, yet 2 police officers still managed to inflict the first damage, wounding Larry Phillips. Positioned about 200 yards from the armed assailant, one of the officers took an enormous risk by exposing himself to hit the robber in the back. He fired twice and succeeded in wounding Larry in the back and buttock. The bandit staggered, then spun around in a rage. He sprayed the officer with armor-piercing rounds, wounding him and his colleagues. The situation grew increasingly tense. Larry and Emil continued to empty their magazines into anything that moved. Police or civilians, no one was spared. Bullets flew from every direction. The robbers then aimed to secure their loot. To do this, Emil fired continuously to cover his accomplice. Larry headed towards the getaway car with the bag of money, which contained 3 anti-theft die packs. Suddenly, the device activated, and the die packs exploded. This covered all the cash stacks in red ink. Larry and Emil could kiss their $300,000 goodbye. The confrontation continued, and surprisingly, the 2 bandits did not seem to want to escape. They even attempted to force open an ATM outside the bank, even though an armada of police officers surrounded them. Larry, not seeming to be in any hurry, casually strolled in front of the bank. He fired at anything that moved, including news helicopters broadcasting the shootout live on television. For Emil Matassariano, things were more complicated. Hit by several bullets, including one that tore open his brow, he was in shock. He took himself out of the fight, slumping into the passenger seat to collect himself. At that moment, they could have easily jumped in their car and sped away. But no, instead, they continued to confront the authorities. Larry likely took perverse pleasure in firing at law enforcement, given his deep-seated hatred for cops. Since he was the leader of the duo, Emil probably just followed his lead. However, at one point, Emil was seen trying to convince his accomplice to bail out. Moving to the driver's side, he opened the passenger door, signaling to his partner that it was time to go. But Larry, seemingly deaf to the suggestion, slammed the door shut with his hip. This scene clearly showed that his partner might have intended to put an end to this rampage. Indeed, it is possible Emil had heard on his police scanner that SWAT was on its way. The SWAT team was en route to assist the officers already on the ground. And confronting SWAT was a whole different ballgame. To try and convince Larry of the urgency to leave, Emil hit the accelerator. He slowly moved the Chevrolet forward, heading towards the north exit of the parking lot. Larry followed on foot, continuing to fire at targets around him. After that, he took cover behind a semi-truck. Meanwhile, Emil, still driving the car, seemed to be waiting for him to finally make their escape. But Larry was not responding to his calls, busy clearing his jammed weapon. It was then that a police officer, positioned directly across from the semi-truck, saw Emil Matasareanu in the Chevrolet and began to fire. A bullet pierced the driver's side window, whizzing inches from Matasareanu's face. Startled, he hit the accelerator and yanked the steering wheel hard, practically lying across the front seats to try and avoid the gunfire. Larry was now alone against the police officers who were swarming from every direction. Kneeling behind the truck, he was still trying to clear his jammed gun, but to no avail. Officer Caporelli, stationed up the street from Larry, sidearm drawn and exposed, then fired at the assailant. He quickly ducked away to avoid the AK-47 blasts. What he did not know was that Larry's weapon had jammed, preventing the assailant from returning fire. Officer Caporelli continued to shoot Larry, who began to falter. A bullet struck him in his right subclavian artery, severing it and causing a severe injury. In response, Larry then pulled out his Beretta pistol and fired off a few retaliatory shots. Suddenly, another officer hit his right hand, making him drop his pistol. He retrieved it from the ground, placed the barrel under his chin, and pulled the trigger one last time. At 9:56 a.m., the first gunman of the North Hollywood shootout was dead. Meanwhile, Emil, whose car had both rear tires shot out and a windshield covered in bullet impacts, tried to hijack another vehicle to escape. For several minutes, he attempted to carjack every car he encountered, but his first two attempts failed. In one instance, he was even seen making a gesture towards Larry, who was 3 blocks east, dead and surrounded by police. Emil tapped his chest twice, as if signaling a final farewell. Emil then attempted to steal a third vehicle, and this time he finally got lucky. A beige Jeep approached from the opposite direction and found itself blocked by the gunman's white Chevrolet. Once alongside, he fired at the driver's windshield. The driver of the pickup, hit by shrapnel in the arm and face, didn't stick around to figure things out, immediately fleeing the scene. Emil now had a getaway vehicle. He transferred his weapons and ammo to the pickup, then tried to start the car. The problem was it wouldn't start. The driver had activated the kill switch, rendering the Jeep unusable. It was then that a police patrol car, carrying 3 SWAT officers, sped up and positioned itself in front of the pickup where Emil was still trying to start the vehicle. Seeing the police car arrive, Emil immediately left the stolen vehicle and took cover behind his Chevrolet. He was preparing to face the SWAT officers who were less than 30 feet away. For the first time, the firepower was finally evenly matched, as the officers were armed with assault rifles. Escape looked grim for the fugitive, which did not stop him from continuing the fight. Pinned behind his car, he was quickly overwhelmed by the relentless barrages of SWAT gunfire coming from all directions. Emil tried to return fire by shooting wildly. However, most of his shots merely riddled his own windshield and the open trunk of the car. The police continued to fire at Emil, who took multiple rounds to the chest, yet Emil was still alive. The metal plate he wore on his chest had saved him from certain death. Seeing the assailant still crouched and in a firing position, the SWAT officers then wisely decided to aim for his unprotected legs. Shots rang out, hitting Emil repeatedly. With his legs riddled with bullets, Emil no longer had the strength to continue. Hit 29 times, he was losing a lot of blood and finally decided to surrender. The SWAT officers then forced him onto his stomach and cuffed him. With a smirk, he still managed to hurl obscenities at them and taunt them. He bled out on the asphalt and died before an ambulance could arrive. The North Hollywood shootout was finally over. It was 44 minutes of sheer terror that morning for police and residents in the North Hollywood neighborhood. During the intense shootout, over 1,700 rounds were fired. Of those, roughly 1,100 came from the robbers' side alone, averaging a shot every 2 seconds. This botched bank robbery ultimately claimed 2 lives, those of the perpetrators themselves, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu. Considering the sheer scale of the violence, it was nothing short of a miracle that only 2 people died. However, the incident left 8 civilians and 12 police officers wounded, 2 of whom suffered such severe injuries they were forced to retire from the force. The damage assessment further reported 12 police cruisers destroyed and 85 civilian vehicles hit by gunfire. Hundreds of bullet pockmarks scarring the walls served as grim reminders of that morning's horror. Once the chaos subsided, the grim task of repairs and cleanup began. Ultimately, the North Hollywood shootout starkly revealed a severe disparity in firepower between law enforcement and criminals. It became immediately clear that this imbalance needed to be addressed. That critical change came in the aftermath of North Hollywood, as the Los Angeles Police Department, and eventually police forces across the entire United States, began equipping officers with semi-automatic rifles. This crucial upgrade aimed to prevent similar incidents from ever happening again. Investigators later found a copy of the movie Heat at Larry Phillips' home. It was widely believed the film, known for its intense bank robbery scenes, served as a twisted inspiration for the duo's criminal exploits. During police raids on Larry and Emil's residences, authorities also seized an arsenal of additional firearms. However, the vast majority of the stolen cash, estimated at around $1.5 million from their prior heists, was never recovered. And so, this dramatic tale ultimately concludes with a lingering mystery.